Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Meredith Evans. I'm the director of the Carter Presidential Library and Museum. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're very excited about today's program. Just a few housekeeping issues. There is no flash photography here. When President Carter comes in, if you'd like to stand, you can, but that's not necessary. We would like you all to put your phones on silence. There's Wi-Fi in this room in case you want to tweet. Any Twitter people? Yay! So there's tweeting abilities. All of that is in your program, but please make sure that your sound is off, including your vibrate. At the end of the 2 o'clock session, we ask everybody to remain seated as the president exits, and we will direct you from that point on and which direction to go and who's moving first. So again, welcome to our program. We're excited for you to be here. And Representative Hank Johnson is next, and he will greet you further.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be here this afternoon to help open the first in a series of National Archives National Conversations on Rights and Justice. What a better place to kick off this inaugural event here at the Jimmy Carter Center than to be here at this Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum. I've always admired President Carter, not just for the humanitarian work he has achieved post-presidency, fighting diseases and helping build budding democracies around the globe, but I've also been a student and a fan and deeply impressed with his many accomplishments while in the White House. While his vision and good deeds may have been overlooked during his time in office, President Carter is a man who, in the light of history, will be remembered for his honesty, his decency, decisiveness, and achievements, and for his courage and his vision. Men and women such as President Carter and other strong leaders in our past exemplify a plain-spoken dignity, integrity, and courage to which I aspire and find too often lacking among today's political leaders and in our political discourse. Today's discussion, civil rights and individual freedom, is both a step towards and a reminder that we must aspire to a more thoughtful approach to civic engagement, equal rights, and our role in American society and democracy. I want to thank AT&T, the Ford Foundation, Seedlings Foundation, and the National Archives Foundation for putting on this important series. And I look forward to following this two-day event, which addresses the challenges to and future of civil rights and individual freedom. And I look forward to following and participating in the larger national conversation. In today's political environment, nothing we do as a nation will be more important than thoughtfully, respectfully, and rationally discussing immigration reform, civil rights and individual freedom, women's rights and gender equality, and educational access and equity. This is what this series will work to achieve, and its timing couldn't be more prescient. Thank you for having me here today, and I wish everyone a fruitful, productive, and enlightening 2 days here at the Carter Center in Atlanta, the city too busy to hate. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Representative Johnson, for being here today. On behalf of our 20,000 Georgia employees, it's an honor to be here. All of us at AT&T are proud to be a part of this year-long celebration, elevating a conversation that is very much a part of our history, our present, and our future. Our own 140-year history of innovation is a story about people from all walks of life and all kinds of backgrounds coming together to connect people with their world everywhere they live and work. Our company has evolved alongside this history with our nation, and our company's story, much like our nation's, is one of passion, of innovation, and of people committed to making things better. Just like we never stop looking for the next solution that makes life easier and keeps us all connected, we also know that a better nation, one firmly rooted in justice, requires constant work because justice is not something suddenly realized. It's a continual journey towards a better tomorrow. And it is our belief that we all have a role in the pursuit of equality and justice. Government agencies, community organizations, and corporations should all respect, abide by, and advance the values rooted in our country's founding. That's why we believe that social justice should matter to a corporation, not just to individuals. Yes, our purpose is business, and hopefully making a profit for our shareholders, but our shareholders are people, Americans mostly, and they expect we'll do business the right way, consistent with their values and our country's values. I'm proud of the history that we have of embracing those values. In the summer of 1962, we worked with Vice President Lyndon Johnson to implement something called the Plan for Progress. AT&T was the largest company in America with roots in every single community. Many workplaces were segregated, and AT&T set an example advancing a non-segregated workplace in every state, every community. We also made a public commitment to hire on merit without discrimination well before equal opportunity was law. In 1975, AT&T was the first major American corporation to adopt a policy prohibiting discrimination against employees based on sexual orientation. And our work does not stop. Through policy, through community efforts, and even through our own dollars, we continue to work. In our last recorded year, AT&T spent $16.5 billion with certified diverse businesses. Our history of innovation has helped to power social change in communities across America. For more than a century, our diverse workforce has shaped our company culture and makes us who we are today. Together, we are humbled to work with all of you in building a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome to the podium the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero. He has a few words.
Thank you, Meredith, and good afternoon. It's great to have you with us today in the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library for our very first national conversation on rights and justice. In 2014, the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library presented a Civil Rights Summit to mark the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The summit brought 4 U.S. presidents, civil rights leaders, scholars, and activists together to discuss the future of civil rights and advocacy in America. One of the biggest things to come out of that conference for me was the realization that there is so much more to say about rights and justice 52 years after the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And the idea for the National Conversations was born out of this need to continue these crucial discussions. As a federal agency, the National Archives is responsible for the collection and preservation of the Charters of Freedom, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, in addition to 13 billion other records that tell the American story and its continued challenges and successes towards a more perfect union. We've chosen the 225th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights to open a new exhibit, Amending America, in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery at the National Archives Museum in Washington. The exhibit showcases both successful and unsuccessful attempts to amend the Constitution. As the permanent home of the Bill of Rights, no institution is better poised than the National Archives to not only celebrate the anniversary of this extraordinary document, but also explore its meaning for civil rights today. We want to use this moment to engage Americans in conversations about complicated issues such as class, gender, politics, race, religion, and sexual orientation through the National Conversations. The content of these discussions will build on the National Archives holdings, connecting key foundational documents to the challenges before us. But our larger goal is more ambitious: to advance discussion of these critical issues in communities across the nation and to bring to the forefront challenges to rights and justice that persist 225 years after the ratification of the Bill of Rights. We'll be using several National Archives locations across the country and partnering with other cultural institutions to present this series. The National Conversations on Rights and Justice will be held in Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Washington, D.C. over the next year. I hope you'll join us for future discussions, either in person or online. And I also want to express my gratitude to our partner, the National Archives Foundation, for supporting this series, and a big thanks goes to our lead sponsor for the Amending America initiative, AT&T, as well as the Ford Foundation and Seedlings Foundation for their belief in the support of the National Conversations. And now we're going to view an introductory film featuring Congressman John Lewis called Amending America. So it really is a terrific video, I promise. So now let's get started with the program. Derreck Kayongo, the Chief Executive at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia, is here today to interview President Jimmy Carter. Derreck and his family fled a civil war in Uganda and settled in Kenya as refugees. He then found his way to the United States, where he became a successful entrepreneur as the founder of the Global Soap Project, a program which takes partially used soap from hotels, recycles them into new bars of soap, and redistributes the new bars to vulnerable populations around the world. He recently co-authored The Roadmap to Success with Dr. Deepak Chopra and Dr. Ken Blanchard. Currently, he's at work on a new book that focuses on how he found his calling in life as a former refugee. And our guest of honor, we're all aware of his many accomplishments, Jimmy Carter, farmer, naval officer, governor, president, and a post-presidency so full of success that he's been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom as well as the Nobel Peace Prize. But perhaps what gets lost in the shaping influence that segregation is the shaping influence that segregation had on his life. Growing up in rural Archery, Georgia, during the 1920s and 30s, Jimmy Carter saw firsthand what segregation was like. From the moment he became governor, saying the time for racial discrimination is over, through his presidency and post-presidency, Jimmy Carter has been one of the strongest advocates for human rights around the world, and the world is a better place because of it. Now please welcome the 39th President of the United States, President Jimmy Carter, and Derreck Kayongo.
Please be seated. I always wanted to say that. Without being clergy, that's kind of impressive. So I do want you to take the time today not only to reflect on the topic, but I want you to take the time to go through the museum. What's really fascinating about the Carter Presidential Library and all presidential libraries is that it's not just about the man or possibly woman, but it's about the office of the president and the complexities of the work that a president does. And I think what the museums do, not only are they the official record of that administration, but through the museum you can actually see the life of a document, and you can see how decisions are made, and how impactful the paper is to the lives of the American people. So part of the discussion today is to talk about how do those civil rights, how does your individual freedom, how does that translate into human rights? And how does what you take to the ballot and the voting and the political participation and the civic participation that you engage in, how it affects all of the lives around you, not just yours and your families, but your neighbors. And so when you think about these issues, whether it's gender inequality, racial inequality, or the right to vote, the right for freedom of speech, the right to exercise religion in whichever way you feel comfortable with, when you think about those things today as we have these conversations, think about how you've taken that to the ballot or not. Think about the laws that have been brought to us and made by us. Think about what happens when you don't vote at your local level, whether it's the school board or your city council, your mayor, your governor, congressman, president. The president functions not just on their own. They don't make decisions by themselves. Each layer of it works, and each layer we have a responsibility as a citizen of the United States to participate in. So some of the other things to think about as we have this conversation, is when you look at the television and you see the protests and you see the strikes and the activism, that's not just expression, but that's how things get to the ballot. Bringing awareness to the issues that mean most to you is one of the most powerful freedoms that we have in this nation. And it's not just those kids or those crazies or those people. Those are people not always hurt either. It's just people that believe in something so passionately that they want the world to know and they want this country to know. So that every time you vote and every time you elect an official, think about those things. Think about why somebody's protesting, why somebody's striking. What is that? How does that directly impact you, your neighbor, your neighborhood, and your job, and all the people that come behind you? So each time that we think about what we can do as an individual, how that collectively benefits us or not, it's interesting to know the hundreds and thousands of amendments that went forth for the Bill of Rights that were not approved. And I think it's fascinating that we get this opportunity to not only discuss national documents that govern us, but see how they directly impact our lives and how our vote matters, how registering to vote allows you to be on a jury and provide somebody with a fair trial, how registering to vote allows your children to go to school where you went to school. Those are the things that we want you to think about. We think about our role as women, as role as people of color, or gender challenges, or how we want to identify ourselves. All of those things we have the freedom in this nation to be and to act and be a part of. And so as we go through this program, not only do we have President Carter and Derreck Kayongo speaking together, afterwards we'll have another panel discussion to really get into very specific things, the Religious Freedom Bill, Rachel's Law, things that directly affect us each and every day. Your vote fixes a pothole, but it also allows us all to go to school together. It allows us all to go through the same door together, allows us all to get the same interest rate on a loan. Your vote matters. Your engagement matters. Whatever bothers you, bring it forth. Share it, organize it, bring it. Those are the things that you have the power to do and be and have. So those are the things I want you to think about as we prepare for President Carter and Derreck Kayongo's conversation. I think it'll be an amazing day. It's a wonderful thing to have a living president, one who roams freely through the grounds here, one that roams freely through Atlanta, never ashamed or never fearful of having a dialogue and conversation, always encouraging you. Not all of us can be elected officials, but we can participate, whether it's student council or school board or city council. We all have a role. And if we don't participate, what do we tell our children? What do we go to the schools and say when they try to figure out why their books are 10 years old and not current day, and the school down the street has computers and one does not? How do you play a role in making those changes? The Carter Center is also a fabulous part of the life of President Carter. And when you come through this museum and when you participate in some of the things in Atlanta, you'll see his growth and how the foundation of being a leadership from governor to president to the global peacemaker that he is at the Carter Center, all through this exhibit you can see. And so it's amazing to have the 39th President of the United States with us today.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a lovely day. I want you to specifically thank President Carter for giving us this wonderful opportunity. And he's healthy. Look at him.
But I'm not as well dressed as you are.
We'll talk about that in a minute. My name is Derreck Kayongo, and I'm the CEO for the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and I'm very proud to be here. We're going to do a couple of things. We're going to do Some quick housekeeping. Please take off your cell phones if you have one into vibrate, I think is what they call it these days. And when we are done with the program, if you could still wait a little bit for me and the president to walk out, that would be lovely as well. And then we'll have some Q&A after our little discussion. So if you have any questions, you write them down and pass them along, and we'll have them answered. President Carter, we are so delighted to talk to you today, but there's a lot of things going on, as you can imagine.
I've heard about it, yeah.
And today's conversation is around rights and justice. It's a national conversation that is really, really serious because we see a lot on TV right now, and particularly around the Bill of Rights, which some of them include the 14th Amendment, which is civil rights. Yeah. And I was curious to see and hear from you what you think about civil rights today versus yesterday.
Well, recently I've been reading about the Founding Fathers. I've read a book about James Madison and Jefferson and Washington later, just to see again, after many years of study a long time ago, about those early days of our own country. And as you all may know, the first draft of the Constitution did not include the Bill of Rights, but they couldn't get enough states to ratify the Constitution of the United States until the Bill of Rights were added. And so that was a very major undertaking, and James Madison and others helped to draft those finally accepted 10 amendments to the Constitution known as the Bill of Rights. That did not include everyone. And it wasn't until after the Civil War when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. And then let me ask you all, when did the women get a right to vote in this country? That's not right. That's when white women got the right to vote. That's a very important thing to remember, because in 1920, the Constitution was passed, but when they said that women had a right to vote, well, you couldn't discriminate because of sex. It just really included white women. And it wasn't until 30-something years later that the civil rights laws were passed when Lyndon Johnson was president after the civil rights movement, and African-American women also got the right to vote. So that was an important issue. And then the 24th Amendment came along later, and you didn't have to pay poll tax. But until then, in the South and some southern states, you had to pay a poll tax in order to vote. So you see that it's been a step-by-step progressive element. I would say in the 60s and 70s, the United States kind of breathed a sigh of relief, because Harry Truman, when I was on a submarine, ordained in 1948 that there would be no discrimination in the military forces or in the civil service. And then that was about 7 years before Rosa Parks sat in the front of a bus, or before Martin Luther King Jr. became famous as the leader of the civil rights movement. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, when that was successful, then, of course, we basically passed the Civil Rights Act, and people all over the country could vote. And I and most other leaders in our country kind of said, well, we've finally succeeded. We've finally provided for equality of treatment for all of our people. That was a fairly brief period of relaxation and self-satisfaction and self-congratulations. But we've seen lately, particularly with the abuse of mostly white policemen against African Americans and so forth, that we still have a long way to go. So I would say that we've had kind of a relapse. And nowadays there seems to be another stirring of a deeper commitment by our country to take another look at ourselves and see what can be done about the rights for everyone. And this includes the gays and lesbians and so forth, as well as people with different races. So we are in a constant struggle in the United States of America to provide, I'd say, a beacon light for other nations to follow and for ourselves to benefit as well. So it's been a long, continuing struggle that still goes on.
You know, at the Center for Civil and Human Rights right now, we are looking at turning that into a voting precinct.
Yes.
And I have an interesting story around that. When I worked for you as an election monitor,
Yes.
when I was at Amnesty and went to Ethiopia to help them vote.
I remember those days,
Yeah,
yes.
and then Sierra Leone, we went together. I had never voted before.
Ah,
I'm Ugandan and I had never had a chance to vote in my own country. And I tell the story that I got a chance to vote for the first time in the United States. And I
Right.
woke up at 3 in the morning. I was like the South Africans. I was in line. But the idea of an African young boy to come into this country and be afforded the same justices that regular born citizens were
Yeah.
afforded was remarkable. So now that we have this issue of voting going on, how do you feel about it? It's a big election year.
it is, we've had a large number of people turn out to vote this year. Some new voters for, I'd say, Trump and Bernie Sanders that hadn't voted before in both parties. But unfortunately, I would say within the Republican Party, particularly state by state, as they have become ascendant or domineering in the state legislature and in the governor's offices, they have tightened up the ability to vote by requiring complicated acquisition of an ID card. And so this is discriminated against many people who are very poor, who've never had a driver's license. I'd say older people who are in nursing homes that don't have a need to drive their own automobiles. And so I think we still see a very deliberate move on the part of some people to exclude those that are not likely to vote for them. When I was governor of Georgia, there was a pretty wide move throughout the country to increase the number of people who voted. So in Georgia, we passed a law that was very interesting, and we designated every high school principal in Georgia to be a voting registrar. Every high school had a voting registrar as a head of a student body. And every May or so, I would have a contest in Georgia while I was governor to see which high school could register the most new people to vote who just were approaching the age of 18. When I got to the White House and attempted to do the same thing, I found that it was impossible. Tip O'Neill, who was, I'd say, a liberal Democrat, finally came to me one day and said, "Mr. President, you are not going to be successful with this because neither Democrats nor Republicans want to open up the rights to vote to a lot of new voters because they're in office because the presently qualified voters have put them there, and they don't want a whole bunch of new, incomprehensible, unpredictable voters to come in and vote." So it's a bipartisan reluctance to let voting be open and free and universal. For a long time, the Carter Center monitored all the elections in China, and there were a lot of them. We were restricted to the 650,000 small villages, which are not part of the Communist Party system. And in China, in those little villages, everyone is automatically registered to vote when they reach the age of 18, which I think we should have in this country as well. Men and women and so forth, you don't have to be a member of the Communist Party. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to do in this country, is to let there be universal voting without going through any procedure once you reach the legal age to vote.
So that's part of the civil rights kind of issue. We have then human rights, which are facing an affront around the world. And I think what is really particularly perturbing is this idea that people feel that rights around the world are being denied. And you are involved heavily in this subject matter. So from the Middle
Carter
East,
Center is,
the
yes.
Carter Center is, and from the Middle East, from Southern Africa, and all these. What do you think about when you think about human rights today versus yesterday?
That's been a very disappointing thing. I'm not just being critical today, but I think the best thing to do is to point out opportunities for improvement rather than just brag on what we've done. We had an era when I was in the Navy of reaching for greatness in moral and ethical values as human beings. It's only happened once in history, so far as I know. And that was immediately after the Second World War, when perhaps 80 million people were killed. And we, in 1945, in San Francisco, we assembled about 45 nations or so, the ones that were victorious in the war primarily. And they established the United Nations with the idea of peace. Peace. And the United Nations and its Security Council were designed so that it would prevent wars in the future. A few years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed and adopted with some caveats. The South Africans wouldn't agree for blacks to vote. Russia would not permit free leaving Russia, and so forth. So there were a few caveats, but most of the time people voted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I would say that at that moment, human beings looked at the combined commitment of the great religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and so forth, and Hinduism, and they took the finest elements of every one of those great religions and put them down into 30 brief paragraphs that comprised the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was almost a perfect picture of how everybody should be treated equally, with equal rights. So the United Nations Security Council has abandoned its commitment to peace. If you're a powerful nation with a permanent member and you have a right to veto, you can do almost anything. And the Security Council will not condemn you. I think the United States has sent armed troops to about 30 countries to fight under the general approbation or approval of the United Nations since the Second World War. And other countries can do the same thing if they're powerful enough. And I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times a few years ago, 2 years ago. It showed that the United States is now violating at least 10 of the 30 paragraphs in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A lot of those relate to the discrimination against women, who are supposed to be equal. It's not just blacks being equal to whites and so forth, but so I think we have a long way to go still. We need to reassess the basic purpose of the United Nations to be for peace, not armed conflict, to resolve issues and recommit ourselves to the basic principles of human rights. And I would urge all of you to just call up on Google Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you'd see it. You can read it in a couple of minutes. There's 30 paragraphs, and it spells out what you should do on human rights. And it's easily violated, and it's easily justified, particularly after something like 9/11. The United States clamped down and took away our own civil rights, including some of mine. That's true. As far as freedom of knowing information of your own, and so we have a long way to go.
There's an interesting lady in the audience here today, Mrs. Abernathy.
Yeah.
And she and I were talking over lunch, and she was recounting her husband's work and everybody's work in the civil rights movement. And I was thinking how that connects to the human rights movement.
Yeah.
Do you as a Georgian feel proud of what the state has gone through and has worked through the civil rights movement? Because you're apparently the home of the civil rights movement, am I right?
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, Martin Luther King Jr. is from Georgia, and we're very proud of what he did and his family did, and the people were associated with him. But there was a time during the 50s when Georgia was very negative on the civil rights movement, and we condemned Martin Luther King Jr. as a communist and somebody that was trying to overthrow or change the basic structure of the federal government, of the U.S. government. And for 100 years, we had legal discrimination against black people. From 1865, you might say almost to 1965, it was a combined commitment of churches and the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court and the American Bar Association all said it's okay to discriminate against African Americans and to consider whites superior. So that was a major accomplishment for him and for those heroes who were in the civil rights movement. And Georgia was one of the few southern states that didn't oppose the change in integrating our schools, for instance, after the Supreme Court ruled that they should be no longer separate but equal. Other states had leaders in Arkansas and so forth that stood in the schoolhouse door, and in some cases the U.S. had to send, armed troops down to make them comply. So we've had a good chance in this state to do well, and of course recently with the LGBT legislators that was passed by the legislature, and the governor very wisely vetoed that legislation. So we're kind of distinguished now against North Carolina, who in the past has been quite enlightened on civil rights. But it shows that we have another battle to fight after the race issue is, we hope someday will be resolved equally. I think we have the challenge of dealing with gay people and lesbians and transgender people.
Two more questions before we go to the audience. There's this need by youth today to be part of the petitioning for rights.
Yes.
And you see that in the Black Lives Matter expression, and you see that in the kids in Africa who are speaking out, and you see Brazil is having a rough time, Argentina, everybody is having a rough time. How do the youth today take this mantle of rights and do it in a way that is respectable and also influential?
If the young people don't do it, it won't be done. It's the young people, say, just take, for instance, college age, whether you're in college or not. That's a time in a human being's formative years when they have a maximum degree of considering new ideas from their classmates, from their professors, from reading more extensively than they have in the past. And they also are unbound by preserving the status quo. Almost as soon as you graduate from college, you lose a substantial part of your human freedom. If you get a job with Delta Airlines, a Coca-Cola company, or a bank, or if you get a job teaching school, you have to comply with the policies of your corporation or the school system. And you lose that freedom that you had on the college campus to speak out with a single voice or get 4 or 5 people to join you, or maybe 40 or 50 to join you. And so that's when there's a stirring of self-analysis, I would say maybe conscience, and you say, what can I do to improve this world? But that is very quickly stamped out when you get a job or when you start having to support a family, whether you're a boy or girl, or man or woman. And so I think that's why that in almost every country on earth, it's the young people who have started the revolutions that have brought about changes or improvements in society.
Do you think today in the United States we're doing a good job bringing up kids that understand moral aptitude?
I think so. I believe on most college campuses, just for instance, and I'm including their peer groups who may not be going in college. There is an effort in most college campuses, not all of them, to originate new ideas and new concepts and to encourage the students to adopt higher ideals or higher aspirations of moral values and ethical values, and to question the political arrangement or the societal arrangements in which they were grown up. And as I said earlier, when you get to be older than they are and start having the family of your own, you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to endanger your own job. You don't want to become unemployed when you've got a wife or children to take care of and so forth. So I would say that in the United States now we have an adequate degree of stirring or opportunities on the campus to speak out in an innovative or sometimes even a semi-revolutionary way.
Those of you who have questions, please. There's one up there. I don't see very well, but yes.
As the leader of the administration that set up a separate Department of Education, and congratulations on that, do you think we would benefit, and would you favor mandatory courses in the curriculum, perhaps as early as elementary school, on human and civil rights, conflict negotiation, conflict resolution and negotiation?
That's a hard question for me to answer because, you know, I think when you start having the federal government, I presume you say, to mandate that you have to have this or that course for fourth graders or eighth graders or seniors in high school, that kind of interferes with the basic commitment I have to let local people decide on their own curriculum. But I would say that there should be within every school a basic social science class showing the history of human rights, which we've just covered in a few minutes in this forum, and also encourage the students to learn about what their own country is doing. Yes, I think it would be a good idea. But you know, I think you have to be careful not to intrude too much on the local Board of Education's right to set their own curriculum.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. President, thank you for being here today.
Sure.
You have led a long and full life, and the world has changed so much in your lifetime. We're looking in the past in the archives, but we're also looking at the future. What tenets or what framework should we look at the future that kind of stays the debate as we deal with this changing world we live in today?
Well, I grew up during the Great Depression years on a farm. All my neighbors were African American, and all my playmates were black. The ones with whom I worked in the field were black. And until I was a teenager, I never realized that they had mandatorily separate and unequal schools. I never realized that their parents couldn't vote. I never realized that my playmates' parents couldn't serve on the jury, that they were deprived of basic rights. And so it was a time for me to learn all about that. And I believe that we have an obligation now as adults to make sure that our children understand not only the highest ideals of what a society should be, to provide equal opportunity, equal rights to everyone, but also to look at the history of successes in the past and to glorify the champions like Andy Young and Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and others that I need not mention.
Jimmy Carter?
Well, I'd say Lyndon Johnson and Harry Truman. You know, because I had boycotts operated against my business, but I never did have a threat to my life and so forth like others have had. So, but anyway, to teach the history of what has been done in the past, and we can all, just within our own families, we can exalt those who were so heroic and far thinking in the past and brought about changes, but also to point out that their achievements have not been perpetuated because of the natural tendency of every one of us to feel superior to somebody else. You know, we all have an element of pride ingrained within us that I'm at least better than somebody else. I'm at least better than a drug addict. I'm at least better than an alcoholic. I'm at least better than a prisoner. I'm at least better than maybe a black person. I'm at least better than a woman. You know, we have those misconceptions that at least we are better than somebody else. But we need to guard them against that. But I think that can be done obviously within a home better if we, and also to some degree, as gentlemen suggested here, in a school climate. Yeah.
There are yellow cards in your program, so we will have people collect those so we can grab these questions and get them on the air. We also we're webcasting this, so we have people who are tweeting, who are sending questions as well in different schools. And so there are volunteers coming around to collect these, and we will bring them to you to read
Okay.
so that they can get them.
But I've got to go to a Willie Nelson concert tonight.
Wow, I hope I can come. While we wait for the collection of questions and some of the things, one of the biggest things that is interesting right now is the subject matter around religion.
Yes.
And I think that some people now are either happy or sad that the new mayor of London happens to be a Muslim.
I spent last week in London, and so
Yeah.
I was able to join in the celebration of most people that he was elected.
How do you think that is different from us in this and our passions around this particular?
Well, this young man who is quite highly qualified, and I don't think anybody doubt about it, and he won without any equivocation. He won a clear victory, although he is a Muslim. And London society, just from observing people in the parks and on the streets, is quite diverse now, and becoming more so. But I think with the present quandary in which Europe finds itself closing its doors to refugees because many of them happen to be Islamic in their faith, I think this has been a clear, good signal for all of Europe to observe.
Yeah.
And so I'm very pleased with that.
In fact, most people don't know that in our Congress we do have a congressman who happens to be Muslim,
Yes.
and one who happens to be Buddhist,
Yeah.
who happens to be in this room today. But here's a question for you from the audience. How do we impress upon younger generation, first-time eligible voters, that change has actually occurred, even though we have more work to do? And how do we restore hope?
Well, it's hard to answer that question, how do we convince the young people? But in our schools and our family life, which I mentioned earlier, we can certainly outline the history of the struggle for human rights, because a lot of people think that the human rights that we presently enjoy have always been with us, particularly in the United States of America. And we don't realize that for many years, women could not vote, and black women could not vote till much later, and that people who didn't pay taxes poll taxes could not vote. We don't realize, and even in our original Constitution didn't have any Bill of Rights in it. Mm-hmm. So I think the first segment of our session here is a quick history that we ought to share with our young people.
This is an interesting one. It's around the idea of power, and does absolute power absolutely?
Yeah.
Is power corrupt inherently? Is the first question.
Is what?
Power corrupt inherently. This current election season has, in my opinion, in the person's opinion, shown that there is no need for super PACs.
No need for super PACs?
Yeah.
Like was ordained by the Supreme Court with Citizens United. Is that super PAC?
I think they're talking about the ones that go behind your back when you're campaigning, and they.
I think one of the stupidest decisions that the Supreme Court has ever made was Citizens United, where they ordained that a corporation had the same characteristics under the Constitution as a human being. And now we have massive infusions of money into the political campaigns. When I ran for office, it was completely different. We raised money just a few dollars at a time, and there was a limit on what anybody could contribute. When I ran in the general election against Gerald Ford, who was an incumbent president, and later against the challenger, Ronald Reagan, you know how much money I raised for the general election? Zero.
Zero?
I didn't have to raise any money. We accepted the $1 per person that a taxpayer can indicate on his tax return form. You can check a little check. You have to do it yourself, and that puts $1 in the pot. So Gerald Ford and I shared the money that was in that pot. We didn't ask a single contributor to give us money. And now we have what I would call legal bribery in this country, because every candidate for Congress, for governor, for U.S. senator, for president has to go out to people and ask for money, and you can't get elected if you ain't get considered to be a nominee for president unless you can raise $100,000 or $200,000 or even more. And so I think that has deteriorated our own electoral system in this country far below the standards that the Carter Center requires when we monitor elections. We wouldn't dream of monitoring an election in a country that had the same rules that the United States has. We've done more than 100 troubled elections, and we require that they have a central election commission, so there's same voting all over the country. The United States lets every county decide basically how people vote, you know, with punch cards and that sort of thing. And we, in other countries, we require that all of the qualified candidates have equal access to radio and television advertisement, whereas in our country, we have to buy it. So I would say that Citizens United ruling was a great setback to inherent democracy in our country, not just to the election process, but the entire gamut of democracy, because it makes every successful elected candidate in the Congress almost obligated to certain special interests for access and to answer their questions and to take their advice on how to vote on crucial issues. I think it's been a terrible setback. And it's all recent.
Yeah. The next one is, what recommendations, in addition to voting, do you have for ordinary citizens to change the discourse among elected officials in Washington, D.C.?
Well, we have, along with that process has come the polarization of parties in Washington, D.C. In addition to the massive infusion of money into the campaign that I've already covered, we also have gerrymandering. When a Republican or Democratic state legislature gets dominant, if the governor is the same party particularly, then they can contrive very complicated delineations of voting districts. Maybe in a certain state like Georgia, they want to put all the black people in the same districts and let them have a few black congressmen who are Democrats. And then the vast majority of the citizens, about 60 or 65% or so, will be in the other districts, and they're basically Republican and white. So this is done all over the country. That's something that the Congress could change if they want to, but they don't, because they benefited from it, the one in Congress now. But that's something that the Supreme Court could rule. I think the Supreme Court could rule quite easily that there should be a blue ribbon commission, for instance, of obviously balanced composition that would decide on the delineation of districts. I think 2 states have this requirement. And that's something that needs, so gerrymandering, contriving districts, and a massive new addition of money has been the 2 worst things, and that has resulted in negative advertising. I never dreamed of having a negative commercial against one of my opponents for president. You know, if I had, I would have been the one that people would have condemned. You shouldn't cast aspersions on your opponent's character. Now, that's where a lot of the money goes that you raise. You raise all these millions of dollars and you spend them on commercials and you try to tear down the reputation of your opponent. So the people get a bad impression of both candidates, and then Republicans will begin to despise Democrats and vice versa. When they get to Washington, they still despise each other. And so you have almost 100% Republicans who will vote against anything President Obama asked for. And so the basic debates take place in the party caucuses. The Republicans all go to their caucus and they decide how to vote, and then they almost have to vote 100% the way the majority says. We used to debate when I was president, you know, but on the floor of the House and Senate, I should have long and very exciting debates to conclude a decision. That's no longer extant. So I'm being very critical of a political process and the government in my country. I feel that way. I don't apologize for it.
This one puts you and I on the spot.
Uh-oh. Read another one. Go ahead, I'll try.
It says, thank you for your call to action for the liberation and dignity for women. What is your message to men who don't think they are sexist, but who support language and policies that oppress women?
Well, I really would like for everybody who's interested in basic human rights or decency or moral values to read the book that I wrote about the oppression of women. It is the worst human rights crime on earth. And the people who perpetrate and enforce discrimination against women are basically men. A lot of these men are religious leaders, where early in my religion, it happens to be Christianity, women were deacons and prophets and spiritual leaders of all kinds, as expressed by St. Paul in his letter. He delineated, gave the names of them. And then after a few years, though, within the Christian community, men became dominant, and over a period of time, women are excluded from roles in churches, which gives a signal to everyone that in the eyes of God, men are superior or women are inferior. If a woman can't be a deacon in the church, or a woman can't be a chaplain, a woman can't be a priest, then this indicates that in the eyes of God, women are not qualified to be a deacon or a chaplain or a priest. And so if a husband wants to dominate his wife or even abuse his wife, he says, well, if the church doesn't think my wife is equal to me, why should I treat her as an equal? And if an employer wants to cheat his women employees by paying her less than a man, they can say, maybe subconsciously, if God doesn't think she's equal to me, why should I treat her as equal to my men workers? So you see, it permeates society. And also the element of violence. I've already blamed the United Nations Security Council for encouraging or condoning violent acts instead of peace. This is also a factor in the abuse of women and girls, where dominant soldiers, primarily men, perpetrate horrible crimes of rape with bayonets and bottles and things of that kind. It's a horrible thing to talk about. In some cases involving United Nations troops, involving troops from countries that volunteer to fight for the United Nations. But so this is terrible. And in my own country, Atlanta, Georgia, I would say is one of the most heavily trafficked places in our country in selling slaves. We have the largest airport on earth, and a lot of our passengers come in from the southern hemisphere, and a lot of the passengers brought in here are dark-skinned or African-American, and they can be sold very cheaply to a brothel. The average price for a female sex worker who's dark-skinned is only $1,000. And the New York Times did an analysis about a year ago or so that showed that a brothel owner can get $36,000 a year profit from her. So there are between 200 and 300 girls sold into slavery in Atlanta every month. And we have discrimination in our military forces as well. So it's not just other countries that are guilty. It's our country as well. And we know that we have a similar serious problem on college campuses with sexual abuse being prevalent. And rarely, even on the most enlightened campuses, and I've spoken at Harvard and Yale and Princeton, as well as other colleges, and they have a serious problem on those campuses as well, and rarely is a rapist on a college campus expelled. And the Justice Department says that over half of the sexual abuse on a campus is perpetrated by rapists who, once they get on a college campus, know that they can satisfy their sexual desires without punishment, with impunity. So they become habitual rapists. So this is what we need to correct in our own country. And in foreign countries, you have women whose sexual organs are abused with horribly mutilated, and you have honor killings and other things which our country is not guilty of. But it happens in every country around the world. So it's the worst overall human rights abuse there is, and the men are responsible for it. It's the same thing that we had during the civil rights time. A lot of white people felt that discrimination or segregation was not right. Mm-hmm. But we benefited from it. We got the best jobs. We got the best education. You know, we were the ones that determined the outcome of a jury case. Mm-hmm. So why should we give up this privilege, even though we know it's wrong? Mm-hmm. And now men benefit from the discrimination against women, so why should we speak out about it? Why should we change the status quo that gives us a superior position in society? Mm-hmm. So men are responsible, to answer your question. It's a long answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. We have a few more before we close. This one is a little bit easier.
Thank you.
And it's for the both of us. And it talks about our upbringings. I find ourselves in an intersection. You have a little African boy over here from Uganda.
Yeah, I want to hear about that.
Who left the country as a former refugee during Idi Amin's time.
Yeah.
And landed in Kenya, where I grew up, and I was raised by an American woman from Pittsburgh, Marge Campbell. Yeah. And she's the one who taught me how to drink iced tea. Being British raised, I was used to high tea. Sure. So I thought she forgot to cook the tea. And then she taught me how to eat cookies, and the British eat biscuits.
Yes, right.
Now that I live here, I know that Americans give biscuits to dogs. Americans are so contrary.
I also had biscuits for breakfast this morning.
You have different kind of biscuits. Your
That's right, yeah.
So it's a baked kind of thing.
I understand that,
yeah. And so then I got to this country, and I checked into a hotel, and the hotel had 3 bars of soap: facial soap, hand-washing soap, and body soap. What's the difference?
I don't know. I grew up with Octagon soap. I don't know if anybody has it. But I don't know the difference between the 3 soaps. I guess it's a matter of perfuming or something. Marketing. That's it. You sell more soap if you can get people to use 3 different kinds.
Yeah. But Americans are bougie like that. You know, they will.
No. That's true. I don't disagree.
So then I end up going to school up at Tufts, and start the company, the Global Soap Project, that recycles all the soap, gives it to the Center for Disease Control and others care to refugee camps back at home. Oh. And now I find myself at the helm of the Center for Civil and Human Rights. That's my little story. Yeah. What is your little story?
Well, to start with soap, we used to make our own soap on the farm. Mm-hmm. And that was a big project that we had. Every time we killed hogs, we made soap. Mm-hmm. So I grew up with, a similar background to yours, but in a different part of the world. Yeah. And now I go into the hotels to have it. So, as I said earlier, I think I was lucky that I just happened to grow up in a community that was African American. Mm-hmm. And my mother was a registered nurse, and she was gone away a lot. Mm-hmm. She sometimes worked 20-hour duty from 2 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. She only got off 4 hours a day. Mm-hmm. And she got paid ostensibly $6 a day for 20 hours. Mm-hmm. So we didn't see my mother very much. And so I was basically raised by African American women. And all my playmates were African American as well. So I benefited ultimately from my mother's enlightened attitude toward the race issue, regardless of the mores and customs of the times. And I think that's where I got my glimpse of what should be done about civil rights at home and human rights on a broad basis. But I've seen the tremendous benefits that can come from opening up an opportunity for people to exhibit their human rights. One of the practical things was in South America. Before I was president, most of the countries in South America were military dictatorships. And they were in bed with the presidents of the United States and with the corporations in the United States, because they were the ones that controlled the iron ore and the bauxite and bananas and pineapples that came from there. And to get a monopoly on those products was a great boon to our country and to our corporations who shared it. And so whenever one of those dictators was threatened by dissenting voices within his own country, from indigenous Indians or from former slaves or from just poor people, the United States would send troops down there to protect our friend, the dictator. So in Colombia and Peru and Argentina and Chile and Brazil and Uruguay and Paraguay and so forth, from almost all those countries, we had military dictatorships. When I established a human rights policy and began to protect the rights of those poor and deprived and weak people to speak up, within 10 years, every country in South America became a democracy. So that's what I'm saying is this is a practical indication of the benefits of just theoretically, helping from a distance for people to have a chance to speak their own mind and to elect their own leaders. So that's part of my background.
So now, I have two kids that I know of at least.
Yeah. I don't know what you mean by that, but I won't.
My wife is over there, Sarah,
All
right over there.
All right.
And Kevin,
Yes.
Kayongo, is growing up as a new American. And when I tell him, Kevin, we are Africans.
How old is Kevin?
Kevin is 16 now.
Okay.
He's 6'4".
Wow.
And he plays basketball, and he's a classically trained pianist.
Oh, really? You should have brought him along.
Yeah, I'm going to bring him next
Bring
time.
him back. Okay.
And then I have Lauren, who is 11.
Yes.
And she's elegantly tough now, because girls are different at that point. I love her to death. How do I take these two American kids and inspire them to understand that the country they live in is a remarkable country? Because we hear so much about the U.S. being a bad country and things are horrible and things are falling apart. And how do we inspire hope right now?
Well, I think there's a lot of reason for hope. Our country has learned the hard way. And the best thing, a characteristic of America that gives me hope is the fact that we have such a heterogeneous population. The United States is not a melting pot. I think it's more of a mosaic, where each individual still has a shining, bright, different color or different characteristic. And when you put them all together, you have a group of courageous innovators that wanted to go to a foreign country to improve themselves or to demonstrate a commitment to a higher ideal, freedom of religion or whatever it was. And so we still have that inherent characteristic in our country. So what we've had over now 230 years or so is not only the ability but the proved commitment and to improve ourselves. We make mistakes, but because we are a free society, our mistakes become increasingly apparent. We've already discussed some of them today. And when those mistakes become adequately apparent to a majority of our people, with a free voice in a democracy, they are self-correcting. So I think that's what gives us hope. And we've seen, I've seen, and you've seen too, in the less than half of my lifetime, I'd say since the 1960s, we've seen, African Americans treated not only equally, but because of their superior quality, in a superior way in basketball and baseball and football and so forth. And so that has given the rest of society who's not interested in sports the realization that we're all equal in God's eyes and in our capabilities. So some people have superior qualities and others don't. So I would say that your children, particularly 6'4" already, he's got a good future ahead of him. I think he'll probably get a scholarship in most colleges. I'm a trustee on a local college in Georgia. The college, by the way, is Mercer University, and I'm a trustee now. But 2 years ago, Mercer, with 4,000 students, beat Duke in basketball. So we could find an open door for your son already. Oh. But I think there's plenty of opportunity for hope.
Oh, thank you. This one is from online. We have about 3 more of these. Women earn less than men. How do you suggest we change this? Or the second question you could tackle is it a right of an elected official to refuse to consider a Supreme Court nominee? Take one of those.
I think that the U.S. Senate Republicans have made a serious mistake in not considering the nominee for the Supreme Court that's been put forward by President Obama. They don't have to approve the very worthy candidate, but if the Judicial Committee would meet and say no, and then present the name to the Senate and they vote and say no, that would be okay with me. But I think to just refuse, as though Obama was already out of office when he had almost a year to go, when the vacancy occurred, I think that's a wrong and a mistake. It doesn't violate the Constitution or the laws, but I think it violates the spirit of our country and sets a bad example for the future. So I think I've answered that question adequately.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some concluding remarks.
Okay.
I'm inspired every day by different people, and in the room today we also have my board member at the Center for Civil and Human Rights and her husband. Andrea is Andrew Young's daughter.
Andy Young's daughter?
Yeah.
Andrea, which one?
She's out there. Where is she? There she is. And her husband, Jerry, right there.
All right. You got a good boss then.
Yeah. And every time I look at her, she inspires me. Who inspires you? What inspires you these days?
Well, I was inspired by her father, Andy Young, and I still am. He set a moral and ethical standard for me as a president in dealing equitably with the people who lived in Africa. And he did it in a quiet way without preaching to me, although he's a preacher, and by just suggesting that we do it. And when Andy went on his first trip to Africa as my ambassador to the United Nations, he went there with just one purpose, that is to say, not what we want you to do, but what can the United States do for you? Yeah. And that was Andy's idea. He's gracious enough to give me credit for it, but it was his idea. So there's still a lot of heroes that I have. Nelson Mandela was a great friend of mine. Yeah. I was one of his intimate circle, and he's been to the Carter Center, and he and I have worked on human rights programs and other things. So there are a lot of heroes still coming along. I'd say one, just to throw in, I started to say throw in a white person, but he's not white, and that was Anwar Sadat. Yeah. But he wasn't white either. So, but a white person that made a great impact on me was my my earliest school superintendent, Miss Julia Coleman. And I would say Admiral Rickover, who was Jewish,
Yes.
but he was except for my mother and father, he was had more influence on my life. So, so we have plenty of heroes that we can look upon. And so we don't need to look very far for inspiration. But I happen to be religious. I believe, I think the ultimate standard of perfection for a human being is the life of Jesus Christ, and that's what I teach the Bible every Sunday morning in my little church. So we can look at ancient times, 2,000 years ago. We can look in recent years and see people who exhibited with human courage and wisdom the highest ideals that should guide us all.
Well, before I thank you for what has been a wonderful and powerful hour with a sagacious man of morality and kindness, I wanted to say you are my hero.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I want to introduce. I can't. It's hard to see here. Is Dr. Meredith Evans here?
Right here.
Okay, I want everybody to recognize. Stand up again. You've been very busy.
Yeah.
But Meredith, she's the director of our library and museum, and she's occupies a very important place, in my life as well. And I wanted to recognize her
wow.
as well.
That's powerful.
Thank you, Meredith, very much. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you so much for coming and being with us. We want to thank the museum for hosting us, Ambassador Peters for being with us, and for everyone here who is a distinguished guest and honored guest. Remember, these are wonderful moments. Treasure them and know that they don't come back. So I wish there were more of us here to listen to a voice of perfection. President Carter, asante sana.
Huh? Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody.
So wait for us to come out.
And if everyone would just keep their seats for a few minutes. One of the things, as you all noticed, we were having some audio problems with the video, and we really would like you to see that. So just like before in reverse, if you'll give me just a minute, we're going to move a few things on the stage.
The Constitution is a living document. It is not static. As citizens, we need to make it real, not just for some of us, but for all of us. The phrase "with liberty and justice for all" mean all. We're one people. We're one family. We're the American family.
The discovery of an individual's liberty is one of the foundational values of being an American citizen. America has been struggling to define the rights and justices associated with that liberty since the creation of its Constitution. From this struggle evolved the monumental Bill of Rights and 17 more amendments to define and protect our liberties. Over time, the amendment process has been tested by a nation whose national sense of liberty, equality, and the inclusion of all citizens evolved with turbulence and struggle.
When we were planning the March on Washington in August of 1963, I would hear Dr. King say things like, "We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters. If not, we will perish as fools."
Freedom, true freedom, is not given by governments. Freedom is taken by the people. The people of America are becoming aware that this freedom to their fellow human beings, and I call them human rights, are theirs to give.
The issues that compel America to continue to define equality and fairness, I think it's innate. I really believe that it's in our soul, that we believe in freedom, freedom of the individual. We believe that humans have a right to peacefully coexist with fellow human beings.
So there are two monumental statues on the Pennsylvania Avenue side of the National Archives building. One inscribed, "Study the past," the other, "What is past is prologue." The message is we should be able to learn from our history so that we're not repeating the same mistakes over and over. And the role of the National Archives is to ensure that people have access to the records that demonstrate how those rights were achieved so that we can learn from those records.
With over 11,000 proposed amendments to the Constitution, and only 27 of those actually ratified, our pursuit of rights and justice continues to be a vibrant part of our democracy. It's up to every generation of Americans to own our democracy and continue this national dialogue of defining our personal liberties.
It is very, very important for all of us as citizens, for all of us as one people, to take ownership of our system of justice. This is our democracy. It belongs to all of us. We must talk about it. We must debate it. We have to continue to fight every single day. If we do not, we will go backward. We don't want to go backward. We want to go forward and complete our effort to create a more perfect union.
It's four and a moderator. Okay, that's fine. Okay.
That. Go ahead and pop that back away. Okay, this is a test for the closed captioning system. Can you hear me? 1, 2, 3, standing by. Thank you.
Amen. And it is done.
This is your ministry staff.
Yeah, but I'm still like tripping. Like, I really wasn't here.
This is our new name.
Yeah, that'll be fine. That'll be perfect.
Isn't it a fabulous
No,
It is
it's
for
just
sure.
not that
It
secure.
really is. It is. And this is my first gig out of Texas.
Because I understand
That I
Yeah.
had to
These
that
pants aren't
flew
very
in
tight.
So I need you to be loud. Imagine that the back row is late to church.
Okay.
And you're going to save every one of them. Why?
All
Can you
right.
do that for me?
My husband's a pastor, so
Okay, so we're in there like we're in there good. So okay.
Oh my goodness.
you mean while I'm up there, I have to
Yes.
be loud?
Yeah, be loud and project for us. Your microphone's here.
Okay. Where will you be
So
standing?
I will
Or
be,
you're in the.
I'll be right there.
So if you can't hear me, just because I'm not very loud and I'm sick and congested.
I'll take care of it.
Okay.
one- yeah.
I lost
Yep.
my voice yesterday. I was just grateful I had something to work with today.
All this stuff. His part. Yep. I love it. Yeah.
So stay
It is
far
a
from the
wonderful
history
place.
department when you
And
get
I've
to
been
Columbia.
there.
Stay far.
I know.
Yeah.
I know about that.
Yeah. When you walk by fair weather, just.
Because this is her.
This isn't right working. It's not working to log into the Wi-Fi. It's not.
You already knew better.
What is 39, and then it was
Oh, now
our
he's-
freedom, but it won't. It doesn't.
Nobody warned
Is that
me.
normal?
Go, honestly.
Is that typical?
You
Oops, sorry.
need, you need her? Miss Warnock. Miss Warnock.
Everybody's miserable.
You got her? Who else you need? It's a guy. It's who's the other young man?
Here.
No, he's you got the moderator? Okay. It's a gentleman. It's Kurt Young.
You're gonna do both?
I'm not sure. You got it? Good.
No, just in
I'll
case.
put on
It
some
comes
lip
up. It comes up and then
She has it.
Carter Center. I know, but it comes up, but then it won't work. Like it comes up like it says enter password, but then it doesn't.
Put on a little lipstick. Just open it up for me, sweet baby.
That's smart.
Okay, you
It's a
pray for
toxic
me up
place,
there.
but I don't know about other departments. I took classes at SEPA.
Whoops.
I did a
No
fellowship
lipstick
there,
in
and it
here.
was great. Atmosphere was nice.
Okay,
People
I
were
know you
happy.
bought some lipstick.
It was a whole nother world. It saved me in my last year there. Of course.
sorry,
Hold
sorry.
that for me, please.
It's
Yeah.
not.
But to answer your question,
Your boy Lewis Gordon.
It's like it.
Lewis Gordon?
Yeah, like it would do this, and then when I try to, it would look like it was pulling something up, like a login, but then it wouldn't do it.
Hey, Pastor. Oh, you know you need to stop.
It's our freedom, but it's not like. Oh, here's part of the presidential library. Will that work?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. And congratulations to you.
So the library one works? Oh, okay. Okay. This one.
Thank you.
Carter Presidential Library. That one?
Capiche.
No, you
Done.
didn't.
You know I am. As soon as I get to the airport, I'll call you right after I check in. Okay. Wait a minute. You're my mirror. Hold on. Hold on.
Tried it earlier.
I feel
It wasn't working. Oh, here we go. See, but this one never comes up. It's like, oh, there we go. See, that just, yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Okay,
Done.
I accept.
I love you back. I love you back. Sweet, beautiful.
Good. Okay, yay. Thank you.
I've got more of a
Trying
voice
to
than I
cheat.
did this morning. I'm still congested. I lost my voice.
Okie dokie.
Oh, good. I got you on speed dial.
The cameras are not on, so I'm going to brush my nose.
I know.
Okay, done.
Will you? Okay, thank you. I'm trying to do.
I'm well, thank you. Okay, I'm looking for something.
Okay. Well, good to see you. Okay.
Hold that baby, because I done put
Reverend
something
Warnock was
somewhere.
not here. He was supposed to
Look,
be.
I have put something somewhere.
Okay.
Did you understand that sentence? Because
I
neither
was
did
looking
I.
forward to seeing him.
We're going to get ready to get started. Ooh, you guys are so good at this. Welcome to the second session of our national conversation. I think it's going to be as engaging as the earlier session was. We have Dr. Jelani Cobb, who's going to lead this wonderful, esteemed panel of scholars and activists and people concerned about our rights and individual freedoms. Housekeeping, if you have a cell phone, please put it on vibrate or silence. There's no flash photography. It will make things challenging for our webcast viewers and for other people around. There is a yellow card which will explain further for questions, and enjoy yourself. Let's keep dialoguing and be in thought. So welcome, Dr. Jelani Cobb.
So let me say that I'm very happy to be here. And even though I'm a northerner, I was born and raised in New York. My mother was from Alabama, my father's from Georgia. And so that means that I have something called home training. So I know that you're supposed to acknowledge your hosts when you are in their presence. So I wanted to say thank you to the staff of the Carter Library here that has done such tremendous work in arranging this. And we go give them a round of applause. Thank you. Absolutely. And in particular, Meredith Evans. And I'd be remiss without mentioning my good friend Khalil Chisholm, who actually brought me here. It was the first time I ever spoke here. He was responsible for it. And so I'm back here. When Khalil calls and asks you to do something, you kind of have to do it. So I actually had another thing that I was supposed to do, and I canceled it because Khalil asked me to do that. So I'm happy to see kind of friends and family here today. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I know you all are looking forward to participating as well. And they told me to make sure that you write your questions down on here. If you have questions, we'll have a little bit of time to get to them at the end. So if you write them down, someone will come and collect them. And then you have the kind of lottery shot at getting your question asked, and we'll do our best to answer it. And so let me introduce the participants in this conversation today. I'm very fortunate to have this good panel of contributors here. To my left is Karin Ryan, and she's a senior policy advisor. She works with former President Jimmy Carter and Mrs. Rosalind Carter on a range of issues, including assisting their efforts on behalf of victims of human rights violations through personal interventions with heads of state. She has represented the center in many international negotiations, including the International Criminal Court, the Human Rights of Women, the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, and most recently the establishment of a UN Human Rights Council, and has worked closely with the UN Office of the High Commission for Human Rights to organize expert consultations designed to strengthen the role of the OCH HR within the United Nations system. On the end here, we have Lisa Williams, who has a very kind of succinct opening statement to her biography, and I think this is a great line. It says, Lisa Williams is a survivor. She understands what it's like to be held at gunpoint, to be demeaned, and be called unprintable names, to be afraid in her own skin, to be repeatedly violated and tortured, and then be blamed for it all. She endured many years of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Abandoned and homeless at age 12, Lisa did what she had to do to survive on the streets and determined very early on that attitude is everything. It has been that belief that helped her turn tragedy into triumph, obstacles into opportunities, and challenges into channels of hope for herself and countless others. To change the trajectory of her life, Lisa pursued her formal education, which today includes a Bachelor of Science degree from Campbell University, a Master's of Arts in Human Resource Development from Bowie State University, and a logistics certificate in petroleum surveillance engineering from the United States Army. On her journey to wholeness and healing from years of traumatic events, Lisa developed an unwavering passion for the empowerment of women and youth, particularly those who have faced sexual abuse and exploitation. And just in the center here, we have a panelist who I'm passingly familiar with Ms. Ouleye Ndoye, who is a doctoral candidate and scholar at Columbia University. Just randomly, because of the way the world works, it seems like not very many years ago at all, I was a professor at Spelman College, and a very serious first-year student popped into my office and said, "I'm told you're my advisor." And that was Ms. Ndoye, and she's gone on to be, that's what I remember her as the most serious first-year student I've ever met. And she's gone on to do wonderful things since then. In addition to being a doctoral candidate at Columbia, she is a Richard Hofstadter Fellow, focusing her studies on African history. She's a native of upstate New York and the recipient of the Weidenfeld Scholarship and Leadership Program Award to attend the University of Oxford, where she received her master's in migration studies. And finally, we have Kurt Young, who is the associate professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Clark Atlanta University. And he's originally from Belize City, grew up in New Jersey and Tampa, Florida. He attended the University of Florida, where he received his undergraduate degree in history, his master's in African and African American studies, and his PhD in political science in 2002. So we have this wonderful, distinguished panel, and I kind of want to jump into it really quickly so we can kind of get to the substance of this conversation. I wonder how you all, if you could talk a little bit about how you all came to have your individual passions, your passions for individual freedom, and the concerns that we're really here to talk about today. Are y'all gonna do that? Are y'all doing one of those panels that starts like, do I have to like start calling on people? Okay, how about we start with Karin and then kind of go down
Good.
here.
Sure, we wouldn't want to presume to
Yeah,
jump in and
I
be
know.
first. Well, thank you, Professor Cobb, also Dr. Cobb, and to all of you. I don't know, it's going to be hard to follow that session earlier. It was so beautiful and sweet and just wonderful. I'm lucky to have been here for a very long time. I won't say how long, because then you're going to look at me and go, really? But I've been here a long time and came up, started as a very enthusiastic volunteer, actually, and ended up working on individual cases of human rights violations. And then I got to work with President and Mrs. Carter. And I had lived overseas. I'd lived in Zaire, now the Congo, and understood how important it was what President Carter achieved with putting human rights at the front of foreign policy. So I think for today's conversation, I think what I'm feeling the urge to think about, to talk about, is to build on what the conversation was that they had, which was, where are we on our journey for human rights? Because civil rights, as we understand it, is very specific to participation, access to participation in civic life. But human rights, as Malcolm X told us, was a broader concept, that we have to see each other as human beings. And there is a way to enshrine that respect for each other in global norms, in the idea of human rights, that we are equal human beings. And we have in recent years been looking at the rights of women, because not only that we have strong women and President Carter and Mrs. Carter feel strongly about it, but this is an area where human beings, half of the planet, are actually not full human beings in the way we live. Even in this country, we never were able to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Women in this country do not enjoy the equal protection of law. And so when we have victims of violence, they are not protected by the law in the same way that men are. We have a situation where women's bodies are commodified in a way where we've normalized violence against women through what we want to call sex work and prostitution, like it's just some other job. Really? Or the abuse of women. So this is what we began to realize, is that we've got to think of human rights and boil it down to specific things like access to voting, but also access to equal protection of the law. So this is sort of what we have been up to here with the leadership of President Carter and our CEO, Marianne Peters, who's here, is really putting that front and center. And President Carter talked about his book on this that he wrote 2 years ago, and it's been a major part of what we're doing. And delighted that others are on the panel giving attention to that issue as well.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to the Carter Center. I'd like to echo Dr. Cobb in thanking Meredith and Khalil for having us here. To answer your question, my initial entry, I think, into the field of human rights came about during a semester studying abroad. I was a student at Spelman majoring in international studies, and they required that we go abroad for a semester, which seemed a bit daunting, so I chose Senegal, where my father is from. I hadn't been since the 90s when I was quite young, and so it was my first time returning as an adult. And we went on a tour of a slum, and it wasn't far in distance from where my grandparents live, probably 10-15-minute ride, but definitely a part of town I would have never seen had I not been with the university there. And from there I was curious and sort of sparked a series of applications to different fellowship programs for research. And I was fortunate to travel and work in the Middle East, in Israel, on issues with African refugees, primarily from Sudan and the DRC. And as a Henry Luce Foundation scholar in Southeast Asia, I was based in Thailand on the Burmese border and on the Lao border, where human sex trafficking is a huge problem. And a few other jobs and fellowships around the world, I was able to see how the definition of human sometimes is actually the real root of the problem when you're talking about human rights. Whose rights are we protecting? And in cases, for example, like Thailand, oftentimes the people most often trafficked are young girls from hill tribes. They're not citizens, they don't have any paperwork, so they're not protected by the state, and they're not considered human. And I think you could apply that to pretty much every situation, whether it's refugees without paperwork or people living in poverty here in the United States or in Atlanta. As President Carter pointed out earlier, Atlanta is a huge center for sex trafficking, and we have some experts here on the city, but we're 75, 85, and 20 split. You have the north and south of the United States, east and west cut together here. And human sex trafficking in a global sense comes right through Atlanta quite easily, as you have people from Southeast Asia brought in through the Mexican border with Texas and up and throughout the different highways and byways throughout our cities. So once I realized that the things I worked on abroad were very much an issue right here at home, it sparked my interest to continue this work.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And I want to start by saying how wonderful it is to share the stage with Dr. Cobb. I've admired your work from afar, and I appreciate the opportunity, as well as my other fellow panelists. I appreciate this question, because the question gives me an opportunity to, in a sense, venerate my ancestors. Your question is an easy question for me to answer, because, in a sense, it chose me. As I'm sure we can all relate to that. It's really a function of my family. My position here is a function of my family, both in the distant sense. I remember, and you mentioned my birthplace, Belize City, Belize. I remember vividly coming to the realization that I belonged to a family that had a very direct personal connection to one of the most active and respected chapters of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the organization that was started by Marcus Garvey and others. He didn't do it alone, of course. And so I began to understand that Garveyite phenomenon in a different kind of way. Of course, there are all types of interpretations and approaches, but at the core of that movement was the uplift of people of African descent all over the planet. And so I related to that, I connected to that. And secondly, I was able to connect to it and then come to where I am now through an understanding and the application of that type of history and those type of experiences to the community that I'm from. I came of age in Jersey City, New Jersey, and Tampa, Florida. Anyone connected to those places? Tampa, Florida, and particularly a distressed but beautiful part of that city called the Robles Park area. And when I graduated from college and continued with my subsequent degrees, I and the rest of my family remained grounded and connected to the dynamics of that community. So although I'm here in Atlanta or different parts of the country, we maintained a connection to the community and became a very active part of the efforts to address the challenges of those communities. So both in the context of, again, this Garveyite tradition and in the broader effort to understand and eradicate all of those isms that make life difficult for human beings to be human. It's really a part of the fabric. And again, I can't take credit for it. It chose me.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It was April 5th, 2007, when I saw the article in our local newspaper that said the selling of Atlanta's children. It could have said the selling of America's children. Here I was sitting on my farm, gated farm, very privileged life, thinking this is a misprint. We cannot be selling our children. On that newspaper was a picture of the child who was being charged with the act of prostitution. She was 10 years old. She was an American child, a full citizen of America. And she stood there alone being charged with an act. She was charged with the crime that had been committed against her. There was something wrong with that. And I didn't know what to do except to get on the phone to call people, because you cannot see an injustice like that and sit still and be okay in your spirit. So it came to me, not from my past, but in the present time that we're sitting in 2007. Today, our work centers around the social determinants that renders our children vulnerable to this and to predators. We have worked in the space of direct services, training and education, and have come full circle, because if we don't dismantle the social determinants, those issues that bring them to that point of being lured and recruited, then we have done nothing.
I want to return to this question about civil and human rights, and I think this is kind of an open-ended question, but I think you all have a unique perspective on this. We've seen, historically, lots of images that we can call to mind, images from slavery, images from the civil rights movement, in which people are completely unaware of the humanity of the people whom they are oppressing. And I wonder if these struggles are somehow different, if there's a reason that we haven't learned these lessons. Have we made progress? Is it more difficult to convey that message now, in 2016? Because it seems almost as if this would be like kind of a relic of a different era, but we don't have the fundamental understanding of what makes a person a human being, what connects us as common individuals.
So I think part of President Carter sort of pitched to this issue a little earlier when he talked about the normalization of violence. And I think part of the problem is that violence is so prevalent in our culture. We have absorbed it as a normal type of behavior. So whether it's in the family, on the schoolyard, in our communities, in our faith communities, in our foreign policy, that the act of violence seems like normal. And even if so there's two questions. First, there's dehumanization and the degree to which you feel entitled to use violence against other people. And then the second level of that is the fact that violence itself is okay. And so I think in order for us to be so okay with violence to a certain degree, we have to dehumanize other people. And what President Carter said earlier, we're always better than someone else. I'm better than another race. I'm better than another gender, et cetera. And something has set in, I think, in our culture that allows us to do that. And we see the spikes in violence, although wars between countries and the number of people dying in wars have gone down. Individual violence is ever present. And so this is what I think about, is like, how do we face that normalization of violence? And then what do we do about it? How do we bring, and I do think faith communities play a particularly important role. And someone told me recently that pornography is very widely abused in their church community. and that this was uncovered. And I thought, if this is so pervasive and it's so accepted, it's so acceptable when that is such a violent, especially now, it's become extremely violent. You see how even our 12-year-old boys have access to it, and our children. It's sort of infecting our ability to see other people as dignified and equal, et cetera. So I think that our faith communities must grapple with this, because this is where moral leadership, and we're in the South, so we can say that. In New York City, it's harder to talk about the role of religion, but here we are in the South.
I grew up in New York City,
Yeah.
in a very religious community.
Okay, so I take it back.
Right.
I take it back. In policy circles, it's awkward, but I do think that's important.
Your question brings to mind a speech given by Amilcar Cabral, I want to say in 1966 in Havana. And Cabral, in this speech, made reference to the necessity for any movement to advance. It had to resolve the internal contradictions. And to the extent that those internal contradictions were not resolved, then you will have a continuation of problems such that a particular kind of movement would not succeed in this effort. So let's expand on that and apply it to this national project that we see here in these United States of America. So there has been this discussion, a conversation in a sense, about freedom and human rights. But there needs to be, I think, a conversation about the conversation. Right, that gets to one of our internal contradictions, which is this capacity, and I think it came out in President Carter's comments early on in his interview, where we almost have this juxtaposition of being able to proclaim with pride the values, the exceptionalism that define, again, this American experience, right? And at the same time, refuse to grapple with the contradictions that defy those proclamations that we make about ourselves. That I see as a contradiction. And that is a contradiction that runs so deep, it continues, and I think it continues to flow such that it will prevent us from grappling with the problem that I think your question suggests. So when we, and I guess that we'll get to this in some kind of way, I don't want to spend too much time here, but when we just now begin to reflect on the experience with the first African-American president of the United States. Right? There was an opportunity there to have a different kind of discourse. But the tendency was to proclaim on the one hand that we had entered into a post-race society, or on the other hand, there was the unleashing of a kind of racial tension that resulted in many ways the dehumanizing of this person who is the holder of the most powerful seat in the world. And so what I would suggest is that part of our difficulty in grappling with that problem is in the very way that we choose or choose not to. I would add one last point. President Carter made a point earlier where he made mention of the progress. I would argue that one of the motive forces behind the progress is when we have these conversations about our conversation, the way we talk about freedom, the way we talk about injustice, the way we talk about race. And when we have those conversations and forced to the forefront in some kind of way, whether it's through a, quote, civil rights movement or some other type of movement, or whether it's through a coming to reckon with some kind of contradiction in the society, broader contradiction, it forces us to move forward. At the same time, I think when we relinquish those opportunities to have a very serious look in the mirror and a very serious dialogue where we're not afraid to deal seriously with the problems that we see, and again, grappling with those contradictions, I think we continue to face those stingy and those very strong and staunch problems that we've been struggling with as a country from the beginning.
Can I interject something here? As a question, you can feel free to respond to the previous one, but I wanted to ask, it occurs to me that to ask, what is it from kind of previous movements that have addressed these issues, that have grappled with these concerns, do we think is useful? And are there lessons from previous movements that we haven't learned? And are there things maybe that are different, that we have kind of completely novel challenges that we have to confront? I want to hear from Ouleye, since she's a former student, I can actually call on her. And actually left out, since Ouleye Ndoye Warnock, I left out her new surname, so.
Well, I think what everyone's touching on is this process of othering. And when you remove the sense of identity and say, well, this person's not like me because we don't share the same citizenship, or this person's not like me because we don't share the same gender. I'm not like that person because they're poor and they live over on that side of the tracks, and I don't go over there, so I don't see them. It's easy to create this invisibility, and I don't think there's anything new about it or anything unique or exceptional to Americans in this process. It happens, I mean, as a historian, I thought you were going to call on me because I was a historian, not because I was your former student.
Well, you were a former student in the history department, so
Okay.
it was implicit.
So, you know,
See, she was like this as a first-year student. Seriously.
Do it.
But yeah, seriously, you do see this happening, you know, in different sectors and different time frames. And I think the way to kind of try to bridge that disconnect, and I was having a conversation with somebody who raises money towards work to empower women and children quite recently, and it's difficult. Universities have an easier time raising money to build a new stadium than organizations that are really serving the least of these, and you have to ask yourself, why is that? I think people, you know, connect with the idea of seeing their name on the doorway into the water fountain, like a part of the basketball court, but not with sending money, you know, even across town, let alone overseas, to work on things that nobody really wants to talk about. They're not pretty issues. They're not proper table conversation a lot of the time. And, you know, you raised the point about pornography in churches and this being uncovered. This isn't the kind of thing, you know, maybe it comes too close to home for some people in their own vices, or maybe it's just something that, you know, they want to pretend doesn't happen in their town. So a lot of times it might be harder for domestic organizations to coalesce a community towards their goals, because it's easier to say, well, that happens, you know, in Thailand, but not here in Atlanta. You know, it's a little bit different here, but it's really not that different. So I think getting people, one, to step out of their comfort zones, and whether it's taking a tour of different part of town or a different neighboring state, let alone if you go overseas, do you really want to take time off the beach to go and visit an orphanage and see what the struggles are and how you can help? Because sometimes it's something as simple as $20 that a girl needs a birth certificate, just the paperwork processed, so that she can enroll in school. And that $20 that you would have spent in 2 or 3 days at Starbucks could go a long way towards allowing someone's whole entire life outlook to be different. So.
Lisa?
I think the then is very much connected to the now. I look at our movement and where we've come from since 2007. We started because of an injustice for a little girl who was 10 years old. We shared that rhetoric, much like they did in the civil rights era of the 60s, with everyone we could come into contact with in community, on our jobs. And then they rallied with us. And then there were hundreds of us speaking on behalf of that child who was once voiceless. And then we took that voice and we went to legislatures and we said laws must be changed. And there wasn't just 1, 2, 3, 4. There were thousands of us across this state of Georgia. And that moved us to work in concert with people we would normally not work in concert with. We worked in concert with men and Republicans and Democrats and independents and people who didn't think like us but knew that there was an injustice, and together we could do something that would change this state and the dignity of those children who were being bought and sold in our communities. And that materialized on May 5th, 2015, with the governor here signing the historic Safe Harbor Rachel's Law into act. That's a direct correlation back to the 60s and the civil rights movement. We just took a page book because we didn't have to reinvent that, right? And when that happened on May 5th, 2015, I looked at the young woman who that bill is now named after. And it was one of those moments in history for me, because across the nation, I can say this because I have traveled and done this work across the nation, most people dismiss girls of color and black girls when we talk about this issue of sex trafficking, as if This was their lot in life. And so therefore, they do not matter. And we're entitled to do what we want with them because they do not matter. They are insignificant, they are invisible, and they are generally voiceless, and they never get a place at the table. And so on May 5th, 2015, when Governor Dell signed the Safe Harbor Rachel's Law into act, it was named after a young African-American girl. It's the only bill in America named after a living African-American woman. Okay. Huge. Huge. And so we didn't reinvent, we just have this modern day slavery, is what we call it. It's what our president called it, that we are dealing with. And we deal with it because these are our children in our state and in our country. My youngest baby that was called, that I had a call in from, was 7 years of age. So for us to look only overseas is unacceptable when we have things going on in our own backyard. So the then is very much a part of the now.
I wondered if you all could talk about social media and how this has impacted the work that you do. If it's facilitated it, if there are things in social media that make this work more difficult, what the net balance of it is.
Yeah, I'm struggling with that right now. I'm almost hesitant to answer this question because I can't claim to be immersed enough in social media to get it quite right. At the same time, I'm seeing some trouble signs. You asked a question a moment ago with regard to the applicability or the transfer, my words, not yours, of some previous period of struggle or movement. And so I think that there are some aspects of movement that belong to a particular point in history that stays there. Although I agree with the point, you can apply some aspects to the challenges that present themselves, especially when it is a result of a clear understanding of the conditions on the ground, the zeitgeist, and the extent to which those actual mechanisms apply. What I'm afraid of is an almost uncritical assumption that social media has replaced those previous mechanisms without a serious discussion of, again, what are the conditions that we are trying to grapple with, and what are the goals that we are trying to achieve, what realities are we trying to transform. And the answers to those questions determine the instruments and the mechanisms. It's sort of like I had a conversation with a student of mine, and he helped clarify what I'm struggling with. Whether you are cooking with an old wood stove or cooking with a microwave, which symbolizes increased technology, you still have to know how to cook, right? The goal is still to nourish oneself. In other words, the goal is not to arrive at the use of a microwave just for the sake of using the microwave technology. The technology becomes an instrument for something. And I'm afraid that if we're not careful, and again, this is a humbling comment because I haven't immersed myself in it yet, but I know how to text and email, but that's about it. I'm still struggling with the Twitter and the other machine, right? But that's my concern, Jelani. I don't want us to gravitate towards what's easy because it's there and at our fingertips, literally, because they're still, depending on, again, the concreteness, we have to make those decisions of the proper instruments based on the realities. And I'm not sure if we're having those conversations. Maybe it's our challenges in the kind of intergenerational transfer of technology, intergenerational transfer of movement that we have that conversation, and maybe it's our fault or previous generations' fault for not having this dialogue with our young people and those who proclaim to use social media in the context of movement. Maybe they're just reaching out and grabbing what's there in the absence of that discussion. Yeah. But I still think we have to have that discussion, otherwise we'll be repeating ourselves again.
I think the nice thing about social media is it allows issues that might not be picked up, for example, by the mainstream news channels to be spread and discussed. And that's the biggest impact that I see, especially on these issues that, like I was saying, nobody really wants to talk about. I mean, now if you turn on the news, all you're really going to hear about is Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And if you're like me, sometimes you just want to put that on mute. And it's
right.
easier to go over to social media and see what else is happening in the world and what else is happening in our state that is not being covered because it's not getting as many ratings. And so it puts the news outlet in the power of people and activists and, you know, to your point, younger people, which Carter said there won't be any change without. So
That's right.
Karin, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I think that I agree that we have to know what it is we're after so that we can decide how to use the tools available. And I think this is where we may be a little lost because the norms and the ideas and who are we is, I think, confused. So Van Jones put out a video yesterday saying, you know, FDR mastered the radio and got the public. JFK mastered the TV and got the public. And Donald Trump has mastered social media and is accelerating with using this. It was a really good point, I thought, because I think there's a caution that we can't dismiss it. We can't dismiss its power. We know that ISIS and Daesh and these groups are using it very effectively, so we can't be naive about it. We have to know it, we have to understand it and how to use it. I think we do have to understand, though, that the civil rights movement succeeded because they had a strategy. They had meetings, they had people meeting face to face, saying, okay, Tuesday we're doing this, Sunday we're doing that, and people were all in. And this is the part, I think we get lazy. We send out a tweet or, and even the Arab Spring, it was a Facebook revolution. Well, it's sort of, something has to accompany this use of the technology. We have to be thinking together about strategy. What is our goal and how do we get there? And it can be an accelerant for good or ill. We better figure out how to use it for good, because if we don't, people are using it for ill.
We're talking about the future of the movement here, and I wanted to just, I guess, ask a foundational question, which is, what about this work in kind of intangible senses? What about this work makes you hopeful? If you're trying to appeal to people, say, this is what you should do, what is it you see that gives you that hope that things can change and that the progress can be made?
Well, I see hope every day when I look in my girl's eyes. I see it in the girl who was being sold on the Cheshire Bridge 2 years ago, who just graduated double major with a 3.5 from Middle Georgia State University. I see it when my girls are accepted at Mercer and Kennesaw State University. I see it when my 2 girls were invited to the United Nations, the 59th Commission on the Status of Women, to speak before women all over the world, the globe. And they stand up there, and they do not go in their victimization, but they go in their power. I see that hope. I see that hope when my girl says to me, I didn't do it right this time, but I'll do it right next time. I'm not giving up. I see it when we've rescued 13 boys and they said, thank you for rescuing us, even though we're not a girl, that you saw us. I see it when we'll go to the polls this November on November 8th, and we have the opportunity to vote for Senate Resolution 7, the funding mechanism, the constitutional amendment here in Georgia that will fund the services and the resources for children who have been victims of human sex trafficking. That's hope for me. It's hope for me when my baby girl says, I have a job, Ms. Williams, and no one is tricking me out anymore. And when the FBI says there's something different about your girls. We have taken girls to many programs, but there's something different about the girls that have come through Living Water. They hold their heads a little different. They stand a little taller. They don't get it all right, none of us do, but they keep trying. There's something that gives me hope about that. It gives me hope that we're having this conversation and we're going to really perhaps walk out thinking a little differently, that race matters when we talk about human trafficking, that services are given and withheld because of a girl's race or her age. If she's 18, she's no longer a child, and she should have known better. I have hope that we in this room can change that when we see a victim, we treat them with the resources and services that they need, but we don't allow them or we make them stay in their victimization, that we become that bridge to help them to become a survivor and next a thriver. That's where my hope is in this whole piece.
Beautiful.
I want to build on this because I think you've pointed to something extremely important. We have to have hope in the work that you're doing, and because it's almost like it's the thing that nobody wants to talk about, right? And there are this great work that you are doing and others to provide services to people who are trapped in what we can call slavery, right? And there are whole jurisdictions where they have adopted a comprehensive approach. In Sweden, they passed a law 15 years ago that sees people who are trapped in the sex trade, child or adult.
That's right.
And says, we know that this would not be a choice that any person would make if they had other options, right? And so we are going to provide housing and childcare and job training because this is something we recognize, okay? But we're also going to hold men, because it's 99% men who buy, so just in case you think I'm using the word man carelessly, not hold the men who buy accountable with stiff penalties, traffickers and pimps, but we're also going to educate the public on the inherent harms of prostitution and trafficking. They're doing that in Sweden. They just passed the law in France. They've passed the law in Canada. They're doing a version of this in Seattle and Cook County. And for me, that's hope, because there is another trend where people are saying, well, sex work, it's cool. It's just another way to make a living. And I'm afraid that young people, I've heard that there's a movement in New York City for students, college students, to legalize prostitution because so they can pay their tuition. And I understand that some people will put this forward as empowering, et cetera, and I get that. I get that that's part of what's part of the new cultural moment of self-determination, but I think it's very misguided, because if we legalize this whole thing, just imagine how many human bodies, mostly girls and women, will have to be supplied to an endless marketplace, right? This is sex we're talking about. Right? So this is actually a thing that's happening right now, and the hope that I have is that places like Sweden and Cook County and Atlanta, where it's being tried, are showing a different way, that we can help people, we can give people what without treating them as sort of like, oh, they don't know their own mind or something, but to really say, no, as a society, we're not just going to give in to this as if this has always been, it's the oldest profession, so oh well, we better just accept it. This is actually a thing happening right now that we have to get informed about, and your work gives me hope, because then I can say to people who are skeptical that look at this amazing work that's being done to actually give girls and women an option, that they don't have to do that. So thank you for that.
I think we have about 5 minutes before we go to, a little bit less actually, before we go to the audience questions. So if you haven't passed them up, please do so now. Ouleye and Kurt, could we get you in on this really quick?
Yeah, good, please.
I was just going to add that, the economy behind this is a big piece of the issue, so it's important to look at the interconnectedness of a lot of the things that we vote on, such as raising minimum wage and providing other employment opportunities, so that young girls don't feel like this is a viable means to pay tuition, because there may be another option available. And likewise, I am inspired by the work that organizations like yours do, and even more so would like to see there not be as much of a need for so many organizations like that. And I think the real way in which you can alleviate the pressure for organizations to pop up and save and recuperate and rehabilitate young girls and boys is for there to be other opportunities. And keeping kids in school is a huge piece of that, which is why all of the organizations always emphasize a component on staying in school education, helping girls finish at least K through 12, then hopefully go on to college. And even, you've talked about some of your girls I know have graduated and gone on for higher education as well. Just all these opportunities raise their ability to earn, and that can really change the entire landscape.
That's a great point. I was thinking about a famous quote by Frantz Fanon in his book, Wretched of the Earth, where he says that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, realize its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. The question is an easy question. It's easy to drift towards the easy answer to that question, which is I'm inspired by the young folk who are taking their own lives in their hands, and they're taking they're seizing the time, and they're trying to make the world anew. But the reality is that young people always do that. Right? That's one of the, we talk about motive forces of movement, or the intergenerational transfer of movement. Young folk always. We are here today and enjoying the kind of experiences that we enjoy because young people at some point chose to make a difference, right? So I was struggling to not give an easy answer like that, right? I reflected a little bit on Cabral's point, on Fanon's point, and what we saw taking place, if you will, if you can, this may just be in my mind, but what I see when I look at a juxtaposition between Jenna in the 1990s, or the movement or the young people who begin to galvanize around the Jenna 6 and Ferguson, what I think I see was, well, let's say it like this. One of the differences between those two reactions was that it didn't take long for what occurred around the Jenna 6 to be absorbed by an older generation of leadership who began to articulate for the young folk who were organizing exactly what they were trying to say. And in the process of doing so, they missed, I think, what the young people were saying in Jenna. What we see occurring, in my mind, and I guess we all saw this play out in front of our very eyes, was that the young people who began to organize in Ferguson took a very careful note to say, not this time. In a sense, we got this, all right? And of course, it made some of our leadership in the civil rights community kind of nervous, right? Because they weren't used to being told to, sit down and move out of the way. But certainly, young people in Ferguson and other types of responses to some of the dynamics that we see unfolding in front of our eyes, I think they demonstrated a certain level of courage, which said that we are prepared to proclaim for ourselves that this is our movement and it's our time. And that's what I think gives me hope. Not that young people are moving, because again, to kind of complete the circle, young people are always moving, they're always responding in some kind of way to challenge what they see to be the distasteful or injustices of their time. But what I think I see happening now is that they're prepared to do so with a certain sense of courage, a certain sense of clarity, even while in the process of figuring it out, right? Because, of course, all generations, and that's the essence of, I think, Fanon's point, out of relative obscurity, which means they have to figure it out themselves. And that's what I think is the beautiful expression that gives me most hope.
Well, I think there are questions. Oh, from an online person. So I think in the interest of time, maybe we can have one person, so we can get as many questions in as possible, one person respond to each question. And the question we have here is, do Black Lives matter? What does civil rights look like today for a community that people believe are now equal?
Well, I guess I'll just take a shot at that because it kind of flows, I think, from the point I was trying to make. I think what's happening, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is getting unfortunately is experiencing an unfortunate treatment right now. I think it's, for the right reasons, there is a rush to compare them to a movement of another period. And because people are hungry for some kind of new type of energy to help to transform and help to continue the need to transform a particular challenge in the society. And some would argue that movements such as Black Lives Matter is well overdue. Right? But I think that we have to give them time to begin to complete the maturation of themselves as a movement. You know, we talk about the civil rights movement as if it was some kind of monolithic movement that just dropped out of the sky and changed the world and left, right? No, it's a movement, even our beginning point, at least our conscious beginning point, where we like to begin in the 1950s. Well, we forget that there was such a thing called a March on Washington movement, right? We forget that we had all types of expressions of civil rights, some very, very famous and some very obscure. All right? We know that some of those movements were absorbed into other more popularly known movements, but this civil rights phenomenon and struggle is a very old phenomenon. And it took time to get to the point where indeed it had the power to transform the world. And we have to give this Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's an unfair question. Well, I respect the question, and I don't want to disrespect the question, because I think it's an important question, but I think the tendency to rush, there is a tendency to rush to a comparison that I don't think is ripe yet. Yeah. Let's give them some time.
Karin, most people think they can't engage in human rights in their everyday lives. How can you guide us to be more involved in our thinking about thinking about and advocating for human rights?
In our everyday lives? So, great. Gives me a chance to plug some good work that's going on. First of all, you have to think in your own life. You have to, if you want to be involved in human rights, the first thing to do is to find something you care about, that you personally care about and you know would get you up on a Saturday morning to go do. And then really learn about that issue and invest the time and figure out who are the other organizations working and go and get involved. We are actually in the process of creating an online collaboration tool. It's called the Forum on Women, and it's women, religion, violence, and power, and it's very much geared towards this question, where people can just plug in. There are other such networking opportunities. I think the main point is to really think within yourself, what do you care about? Pick something that just really talks to your heart, and really dive in and go in for the long term. You know, try not to just dabble. You know, dabble until you find the thing. But human rights needs us all because it's actually quite in danger. We are really in danger of losing what President Carter described earlier as these global norms. We have normalized torture in our country because of Guantanamo and the post 9/11. We have normalized indefinite detention. We have normalized violence against women. We are in danger. You know, warrantless wiretapping. We have the right to privacy is actually gone. Right? And without us really making much of a thing about it, right? So these are things that it's really time to wake up and get engaged in these and get a hold of it and don't let go. Yeah.
Lisa, what programs are active in the U.S. and other countries to educate young men so that there is a diminished market for prostitution and less acceptance of domestic violence, et cetera?
Not enough.
Yeah.
That's the real answer. I can give you a few organizations, but not enough. There are Men Against Violence, Men Against Domestic Violence. There are Boys and Men programs, but certainly not enough. And when a boy will look at me and say he wish he was a girl, that tells me that we have fallen down on this job. So the answer must be not enough. We need people to step up to the plate to answer the call. We can do only so much as women in terms of helping a young man become a young man. We need men to help do that process. Now, in lieu of that, until it happens, we will continue to fill that void. But we don't have the programs necessary. We don't have a shelter specifically for males who have been victims of trafficking. How do we say that is okay? Again, my answer is not enough. I would like to add this. I have learned that when I save one male, I generally, on average, save 3 to 4 girls. Because he will not go to try to profit off of her body. When I can put him in school, in a classroom, give him a support system, the mentors that are necessary, counseling if that's required as well, housing, food, and a part-time or full-time job, then he doesn't see it as a necessary evil for him to go and prostitute a child, another girl, or sell another woman.
So earlier, President Carter said that when he was talking about racism, he said, you know, whites benefited from it. He said that was why it was so hard to uproot. I wonder if we could kind of open this up for everyone to talk about some of the ways that men benefit from the dehumanization of women and how that impacts the difficulty in uprooting that in the society, the country, and the world.
I'm going to broaden that a bit.
Broader than the world?
No. Broaden the men aspect, because I think that in a lot of societies, and I'll speak from my context of internationally in Southeast Asia, you can go through a village and kind of walk along the street and you see straw hut houses constructed with mud and different products from the environment. And then you'll see this big white porcelain home with marble floors and lions at the entryway and a pickup truck, which is a big status symbol because of the terrain there. It helps you get around a lot better than a tuk-tuk. And in certain areas in the north, like when you see a house like that, you know that means that one of the daughters is working in Bangkok as a waitress. And that's socially acceptable and actually something that some girls, not knowing what their life will be like in Bangkok or Pattaya or any of these other beach town resort areas, they look forward to it because they see the girl that they used to look up to down the street has gone out of town to the big city and come back with money, and her family is doing better because of her, and they've built up levels to their house and they've upgraded their vehicles. And so it's a status, prestige. And so the onus also falls, you know, on, of course, the men who are buying this, but also the families and the societies that glamorize and really admire status that's coming through these kind of unjust work systems. And so there's a lot to undo there, because sometimes organizations such as yours that exist in these international contexts are made up of Westerners who come in from the United States or Europe or Sweden with our contexts of this is terrible, we need to end this, we need to save them. And they'll go right back to it, not because they love the work, but because they have an entire family of 50 people depending on that money. And so again, the economy and the structures, yes, they need to be in place, but even if in an ideal context you give paperwork and they're no longer Hill Tribe girls, they're now Thai citizens, and they can be saved from this by the authorities who, by the way, often just sit there and pretend that they don't see. I mean, there are police on every corner in these club areas, but they're just not doing what you might expect them to do. And you could have a 7-year-old girl doing backbends and dancing on a table outside of a club and a police officer 4 feet away. I have pictures of this kind of arrangement where you really seeing is believing. And when I give presentations with this, people are like, well, what's that officer doing? Well, not what you would assume, right? And so, but even if all of this was in place, there's always going to be another girl that they can replace her with. And so it goes deeper than the men buying the services. It also goes to the family contexts, the government support, the police officers or border officers, and who's getting paid off along the way. It's a very intricate financial network.
Can I add to that? So here in America, when I looked at that same problem, we learned that we had to go and unpack some family secrets. And no one ever wants to talk about those kinds of things. So our girls would often go home and call back and say, I can't live at home because they don't understand the new me. And they want me to be the old person because my mother was also a victim of this or abuse, and they don't know how to treat me. For instance, I'll call her Dee, and Dee was 12 years old. She was the first girl brought to me by the FBI, and she had been with us 9 months. And when she returned home, she had learned that she only was supposed to answer to her name, Dee. And when she returned home, they called her out of her name. And when she refused to answer them, and those who called her out of her name were her family members, she was faced with one or two things: to run away or to stay in a home and be abused there. And so it wasn't the men that we were dealing with having to sell, it was the family unit. And we had to go back and help mothers and fathers unpack some things and understand the trauma that their daughters or sons had endured and understand what made them vulnerable and how they were perpetuating it in the family. Those things are very difficult to do because no one wants to be told that they have helped in the victimization of their child. And that's the work that we've been doing over the last few years. And because of that work and being very honest about it and having those conversations because they need to be had, we saw girls staying in homes much longer. So we got about a 67% rate of girls not running because now families understand who they are, how to act, and we've given them, like other organizations who do really good work, great support systems to help them navigate this thing. No one understands this thing that takes a hold of a child that has been sold or handcuffed and put in dog cages and sold on the market to the highest bidder. You don't understand what she's thinking or he's thinking every moment of the day. But when we can impart some of that knowledge, then that changes in the family dynamics and they can keep our girls and boys safer.
I'll just add one to this, just because, just to put a cap on this rather pleasant conversation of all this human suffering. I think one that we don't talk about, it's so uncomfortable to talk about, is pornography, because pornography is actually bigger than the sex trade itself, the physical encounter. It is the biggest commerce, area of commerce.
It is certainly the gateway, for sure.
What I mean is
Absolutely.
that the amount of transactions
Certainly.
are more online than in person. And the statistics are terrible. People, mostly women, last 3 months in pornography until they're cast aside, until they have no, and it's become more and more violent. The more fringe, super hyper-violent pornography has now become mainstream, and this is all available to 12-year-old boys on their phones.
And can we say girls too, because that's a growing market.
It is.
And we don't talk about that. I think when we have a conversation, we need to be very honest in the conversation. When we talk only men are the ones benefiting from children being trafficked, we must also say women are too. And we need to say that because when you know your husband, your son, your uncle, they are participating in this and you do nothing about it, you're a part of the problem as well. And we're not saying that out loud. We're not saying that women are traffickers as well. And we need to have those conversations if we're to ever truly protect our children. And yes, pornography is not just a gateway, but it is one of the largest moneymakers out there when it comes to boys and girls. We don't want to talk about it because our next door neighbor may be a person who is participating or buying that pornography. And that is uncomfortable for most.
Right, and we forget that the thing that's being filmed is an extremely violent thing.
Absolutely.
So it's the filming. I know a woman who is a survivor of prostitution, and she says, thank God I was never filmed. She had a horrible experience. It was very violent. But she said, at least I was never on film. There's no record of it. But the girls, and mostly, and I say this mostly because the vast majority of those who are victimized are female. But males who, there's now the top porn king who came out and said he's now talking about how horrible of a life choice that was for him, how he regrets it. He's, in his 50s now. And so I'm only raising this because you asked about male privilege and male, sort of how do men benefit. And I think there is this idea that this is a form of entertainment. It really is way too normalized in our society. It's a form of entertainment. It's okay, it's fun, hey, hey, hey. But people are harmed, seriously harmed in this thing. And I would ask, that we think about that, because by participating, every time you click on that, someone is being harmed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And money is exchanged. A profiteer is profiting. And I think this is a very concrete area that we could ask ourselves to challenge.
I know we have a lot more that we could say here, but we have a hard out for the C-SPAN audience. So I want to invite Meredith Evans up to give her closing comments. But first, I want to thank everyone up here for participating.
Thank you very much. If the panel would stay a little, this dialogue is too good to let go, but we have an online audience and a C-SPAN audience we need to conclude with. So tomorrow, we will continue this national conversation. It's about activism today, where we will probably address some social media that was mentioned here today. We have 3 wonderful emerging leaders speaking tomorrow, moderated by Maurice Hobson. So we're going to continue this conversation. So webcast and C-SPAN and my online community will be back tomorrow. For you here in the audience, I think we should continue this dialogue for a little while longer. There is hope, and I think knowing our rights and understanding civil rights and the human rights component that it leads to is of huge importance. So thank you, panelists.
So, Karin, I wanted to know if you wanted to weigh in on the question that was on the floor.
No privilege.
About the ways that men benefit from the dehumanization of women.
So what becomes clear to me as I listen to this conversation is the extent to which, in addition to the decisions that men make that's harmful to our young ladies, there's a broader problem, which are those societal forces that reinforces or that gives legitimacy to the decisions that men make. Right? I really appreciate your point. You make reference to the family, and if I could just expand on the family concept and to broaden that to assume that we're discussing the societal family, the society as a family. So it seems to me as you were speaking, I'm listening and thinking about this very vicious cycle where you have a position of oppression that women occupy. Men benefit from that because of the social forces that are in play, in addition to the very illegitimate decisions that we make. Let's be honest, we sometimes make very conscious decisions about the actions that we will take. And then those actions then turn right back around and reinforce the social assumptions about the places that women should occupy and the places that are legitimately places of power that men should occupy. Of course, anytime we talk about cycles, it begs the next question: where is the break point? Where do you break that cycle? Where do you identify the weak point so that one could interrupt this process, right? So, but for me, I think, Jelani, the most obvious benefit that men garner is that the society in turn reinforces the positions that we can easily hide behind, right? We find ourselves able to say, well, it's this way because it's the way it is. Or women have always occupied this position, or here's one where we can say that, well, I did this because my dad did it, and my dad did it because my grandfather did it, and so on and so forth. Or this is all that I saw growing up in terms of the positions that women occupy. Unfortunately, we hear that contradiction most glaringly and most up front in some of the hip-hop dialogue. Yeah. Now, let's be clear, I'm a child of the hip-hop era, and I do not intend to chastise them unfairly. In fact, there was a point where they called me Freeze, right? In my b-boy days, right? So I don't mean to be hypocritical, but the point that I'm making is that what we tend to see is a kind of theme in the art form that says that I'm only talking about what I see in my community every day, and of course what's folded in that is the way that we talk about women in the art form, and so that would be the way that I see this benefit. We benefit because the society deems it as such.
There's a question I think I actually want to answer if it's okay. American exceptionalism is said to be the basis of dehumanizing the quote-unquote other. Please define the term and recommend how you teach Americans cultural competence to avoid dehumanization. I mean, that's interesting to me because I teach American history, and I disagree with the question to say that American exceptionalism is the basis of dehumanizing others. I think American exceptionalism is the product of this process of dehumanizing others, and that we've seen ourselves as an exceptional society. And I don't know, it's interesting because I grew up in a family in which you were discouraged from kind of self-praise. think my father said self-praise is a half compliment or something along those lines. And so the idea that, that this constitutes an exceptional nation should be said by other nations, not by this one. And in fact, the focus on one's exceptionalism is the easiest means to ensure that anything that you did accomplish that was exceptional will be lost, that you'll no longer be able to accomplish those things. And so I don't think that American exceptionalism is the basis for it. I think it's a product of this process. But one of the other things that we should be mindful of is the ways in which our conception of ourselves as a group of people who are kind of outside of history, a group of people who are outside the normal ups and downs of the human existence, has been a disincentive toward confronting and challenging the actual concerns we have. And so I was talking with a French journalist, and he posed a question to me that said, this is a while back, he said, I'm interviewing people about this question about whether or not the United States is still a role model among nations. And I said, what do you mean? A role model in the sense that we orchestrated Jim Crow and it became the basis for apartheid in South Africa? Or the role model in the fact that our racial policies were quoted and praised by Hitler as he created the Nazi regime? Or a role model in the sense that we have now allowed the use of torture? Or a role model in any of these things. And I say this to say, this is the oldest constitutional democracy in the world, and an institution that has enshrined the Bill of Rights that we're talking about today, but also tremendously flawed undertaking, as any human undertaking would be. And as our unwillingness to grapple with those tremendous flaws that allows them to persist in the present. And I think those are the things that we have to be mindful of. This dehumanization is something that is kind of implicit in our human abilities, the range of human personality. We know that. And what the effort of civilization has been is to remove that, to make ourselves one step removed from it. And there's a reason why all the great religions of the world have explicit reference to how one treats strangers. Because left to our own devices, we will hit the stranger over the head with the club. But we have to have these parables, and we have to have these surahs, and we have to have these religious edicts that tell us, don't hit the stranger over the head with the club, see the stranger as your brother and your sister. And hopefully after enough socialization to actually we begin to look at the world this way. And so I just took that question, so I guess I need to get another question.
That was great. That was great. That was great. That was perfect.
Was that a perfect ending?
That was perfect.
All right, then I think we'll wrap up here. The cane here, she's come out and yanked us off stage. So thank you very much.
Thank you.